The hospital corridor fell silent as he entered, the most feared man in Chicago. A dying woman's face turned pale with recognition, while their daughter innocently asked him to marry her mother. Blood ties and forbidden love collided in that sterile room, but no one imagined the price they would pay for a single glance across time. Where are you watching this heartbreaking Mafia tale from? Drop a comment below and hit subscribe for more stories where family secrets and forbidden love collide. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room burned Antonio Velluti's nostrils as he stood frozen in the doorway. Monitors beeped rhythmically next to the bed where Elena Moretti lay, a ghost from his past, now reduced to a pale shadow beneath white sheets. 10 years had passed since he'd seen her last. 10 years since she disappeared without a trace, taking with her secrets he never knew existed. "Are you going to marry my mommy?" "Ah." The small voice pierced the silence. Antonio's gaze dropped to the little girl with familiar dark eyes, his eyes staring up at him with innocent hope. Her tiny hand clutched a worn teddy bear missing one eye, the stuffing poking through worn seams. "The nurse said, Mommy only has 1 week left," the child continued, unaware of how each word drove a dagger deeper into Antonio's chest. "She needs someone to take care of her. And me." Behind them, a nurse hovered nervously in the doorway, recognizing the notorious crime boss who controlled half of Chicago with an iron fist. She'd called him because Elena had whispered his name during a morphine-induced delirium. Now she was clearly regretting that decision. "Isabella, come here," Elena whispered from the bed, her voice barely audible above the machines keeping her alive. Her eyes, once vibrant with defiance, now widened with terror as they fixed on Antonio. Would this be their final confrontation? Could he forgive the woman who had fled with what now appeared to be his flesh and blood? Antonio's fingers tightened around the bouquet he'd instinctively purchased in the hospital gift shop, crushing the stems. The dream he'd had 3 nights ago flashed through his mind. A dream of Elena calling his name from a white room, a child crying in the background. "Everyone out," he commanded, his voice deceptively soft. The nurse scurried away immediately. "Not you," he added, stopping Isabella with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You stay." The door closed behind the nurse with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sterile room. 3 heartbeats, one strong, one faltering, one innocent, filled the silence. "You should not be here," Elena whispered, tears spilling down her hollow cheeks. "How did you find us?" "Your nurse called me. You said my name in your sleep." Antonio moved closer, still keeping the child protectively near him. "Were you ever going to tell me?" Eleanor's eyes darted to Isabella, then back to Antonio. A silent plea. "Mommy, do you know this man?" Isabella asked, confusion wrinkling her brow. The monitors began beeping faster as Elena's heart rate increased. A storm of emotions crossed her face. Fear, regret, and something else Antonio couldn't identify. Would this revelation kill her even faster than the cancer eating through her body? "Isabella, this is—" Elena began, her voice breaking. Antonio felt the child's curious gaze burning into him. 10 years of absence. 10 years of a daughter growing up without him. His empire meant nothing in this moment, this fragile bubble of time where past sins and future possibilities collided. "I'm an old friend of your mother's," he finished smoothly, giving Elena a barely perceptible nod. "Not now. Not like this." But the observant child tilted her head, studying his face with unnerving intensity. "You have eyes like mine," she remarked innocently. The room seemed to shrink around them. Antonio noticed his men waiting nervously in the hallway through the small window in the door, wondering what kept their boss so long in a hospital room. His world of violence and power felt distant now, separated from this sterile space where life and death balanced on the edge of a knife. "Isabella, go ask the nurse for some juice," Elena instructed, her voice steadier now, fortified by maternal protectiveness. When the door closed behind the reluctant child, Elena struggled to sit up, wincing with pain. "You can't take her, Antonio. You can't bring her into your world." "My world?" Antonio's voice turned cold. "The world you were once happy to share? The world you fled without a word? I left because I had to protect her." Elena's outburst triggered a coughing fit that left bloody specks on the white sheet. "From your enemies, from you." Antonio moved closer, his fingertips hovering inches from her frail arm, afraid she might shatter at his touch. "Is she mine?" he asked, though the answer was written in the child's familiar eyes. "Would it matter if I said no?" Elena challenged weakly. Outside the window, dark clouds gathered, casting shadows across her bed. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a storm approaching, much like the tempest building in Antonio's heart. He had lost 10 years with his daughter. Now Elena was slipping away, taking all her secrets with her. "1 week," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "The doctors give you 1 week." Elena's laugh was hollow, painful. Always the businessman, calculating costs and time frames. "What happened to us, Elena?" The question escaped before he could stop it, vulnerable in a way Antonio Velluti never allowed himself to be. Her eyes softened momentarily. Life happened. Death is happening. And Isabella deserves better than to be caught between. The rain lashed against the windows of Antonio's penthouse as he poured another glass of whiskey. 3 hours had passed since he'd left the hospital, and his mind still reeled from the discovery. Isabella, his daughter, would soon be orphaned by her mother's death. The thought sent ice through his veins, despite the alcohol burning his throat. His phone buzzed for the 12th time. 12 missed calls from his consigliere, Paolo, warning of an imminent threat from the Russo family. Territory disputes were escalating in the south side, and blood had been spilled. On any other day, Antonio would have already ordered retribution. Today, the empire he'd built seemed suddenly hollow. "Boss!" Marco, his most trusted bodyguard, appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his scarred face. "The Russos are making moves. Paolo says we need to respond tonight." Antonio stared at the amber liquid in his glass. "Did you know I was once going to leave all this behind? For a woman?" Marco shifted uncomfortably. He had been with Antonio long enough to remember Elena, though her name had been forbidden in the household for a decade. "I've arranged for 2 men to guard her hospital room," Antonio continued, ignoring his bodyguard's discomfort. "No one enters except medical staff I've personally cleared." "Her?" Marco's eyebrows rose slightly. "Elena Moretti. She's dying." The words felt strange on his tongue, bitter and final. "Cancer. She has a daughter. My daughter." The revelation hung in the air between them. Marco's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes betrayed his shock. In their world, secrets like these were dangerous, potentially fatal. "Does Paolo know?" Marco finally asked. "No one knows except you, and that's how it will remain until I decide otherwise." Antonio set down his glass with deliberate care. "I need to see her again, tonight. The Russos can wait." Antonio's tone left no room for argument. "My daughter has lived 10 years without knowing me. Her mother has 7 days to live at most. The Russos have been a thorn in my side for years. They can be won for another day." The hospital corridor was quiet when Antonio returned shortly before midnight. His men nodded respectfully as he approached Elena's room. Through the small window, he could see Isabella curled up in a chair beside her mother's bed, asleep with her head at an uncomfortable angle, still clutching her one-eyed teddy bear. He entered silently, careful not to wake either of them. Elena's breathing was labored, each rise and fall of her chest a battle. The moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across her face, once beautiful, now gaunt with suffering. You came back. Elena's eyes fluttered open, her voice barely audible above the machinery. Antonio moved closer, pulling a chair to her bedside. I needed answers. Always so demanding, she whispered, a ghost of her former fire sparking in her eyes. Some things never change. Isabella stirred in her sleep, murmuring something incoherent. Both adults froze, watching as she settled back into dreams. She looks like you when you sleep, Elena observed, her gaze softening as it rested on their daughter. Same furrowed brow. Why didn't you tell me? Antonio kept his voice low, but the intensity burned through his whispered words. Why did you run? Elena's fingers plucked weakly at the thin hospital blanket. Do you remember Julia Esposito? The name sent a cold wave through Antonio. Julia had been the 7-year-old daughter of one of his rivals. She had died in a car explosion meant for her father, collateral damage in a war she never asked to be part of. That was different, he protested, knowing the lie even as he spoke it. Was it? Lena challenged, summoning strength from somewhere deep within. I was there, Antonio. I saw what happened to families in your world. I was 3 months pregnant. What choice did I have? The machines beeped steadily, counting heartbeats, measuring oxygen, marking the unstoppable march toward an ending. Outside, a nurse passed by, her shadow briefly darkening the doorway. I would have protected you both, Antonio insisted, leaning closer. Elena's laugh was a painful, broken sound. Like you protected Julia? Like you protected any of the innocents caught in your war? Her words sliced through his carefully constructed justifications. For the first time, Antonio saw himself through her eyes, not the powerful, respected man he believed himself to be, but something darker, more dangerous. She's thrived without you, Elena continued, glancing at Isabella. She's smart, kind, stubborn like her father. She deserves a life away from all this. And now, when you're gone? The brutal question hung between them. What happens to her then? Elena closed her eyes, tears seeping from beneath her lashes. My sister in Boston. She's my daughter, Antonio interrupted, surprising himself with the fierceness of his claim. My blood. Your blood is exactly what I fear, Eleanor whispered. As if sensing the tension, Isabella stirred again, this time blinking awake. Her drowsy eyes focused first on her mother, then widened as she noticed Antonio. You came back, she said, unconsciously echoing her mother's earlier words. Antonio found himself smiling despite the gravity of the moment. I did. Are you going to marry my mommy now? Isabella asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. 2 days passed in a blur of hospital visits and neglected business. Antonio found himself drawn back to Elena's room at every opportunity, watching Isabella's animated face as she chatted about school, books, and the small details of her life he had missed. With each visit, Elena seemed to fade further, her skin taking on a translucent quality that spoke of her approaching end. The Russos hit one of our warehouses last night, Paolo reported, his voice tight with barely contained frustration as they stood in the hospital parking garage. 4 men dead, including Salvatore's nephew. They're taking your absence as weakness, boss. Antonio straightened his tie, preparing to enter the hospital for the 3rd time that day. Increase security at all locations. No retaliation yet. No retaliation. Paolo's voice rose in disbelief. The other families are watching. Salvatore deserves blood for his nephew. And he'll have it, Antonio assured him coldly, but on my timeline, not theirs. Paolo stepped closer, lowering his voice. There are rumors, Antonio, about where you've been spending your time, about a woman and a child. Antonio's hand moved instinctively toward his shoulder holster. Careful, old friend. I've been by your side for 20 years, Paolo said, unflinching despite the implied threat. Whatever this is, whatever you're involved in, it affects all of us. The organization deserves to know if there's a succession issue. The crude phrasing made Antonio's blood boil. Isabella wasn't a succession issue. She was his daughter, a child who deserved protection, not the burden of his bloody legacy. 3 more days, Antonio said finally. Give me 3 days to resolve this personal matter. Then we deal with the Russos permanently. Outside Elena's room, Marco waited with a tense expression. She's had a bad morning, boss. The doctor was just here. They've increased her pain medication. Antonio steeled himself before entering. Isabella sat by the window today, drawing on a sketch pad, while Elena appeared to be sleeping, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Antonio!" Isabella's face brightened when she saw him. She spoke in a stage whisper, conscious of her mother's rest. "Look what I drew!" He crossed to examine her artwork, a house with 4 stick figures standing in front. "Who are they?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "That's me." She pointed to the smallest figure. "And that's Mom when she gets better." "That's you, and that's your friend with the funny face." Antonio suppressed a smile, recognizing Marco's scarred visage in the crude drawing. "It's very good. But your mother—" "I know she's really sick," Isabella interrupted, her voice suddenly serious in a way no child's should be. "But in my drawing, she gets better and we all live together." "Do you think that could happen?" The innocent question struck Antonio speechless. In his world of absolutes, where problems were solved with money or bullets, Elena's cancer presented an implacable enemy he couldn't defeat. From the bed came a soft sound. Elena's eyes were open, watching them with a gaze made hazy by morphine. "Isabella," she called weakly, "could you ask the nurse for some ice chips, please?" When the child had left, Elena beckoned Antonio closer with a trembling hand. "We need to talk, while I'm still lucid enough." He sat beside her, noticing how the hospital bed seemed to swallow her diminishing form. "The doctors?" "And say what doctors always say when they've run out of options. Comfortable, peaceful." She spat the words like poison. "There's nothing peaceful about leaving your child." Antonio took her fragile hand in his, surprising both of them. "Elena, no," she interrupted with unexpected firmness. "Listen to me. Isabella can't stay with my sister. Karen has 4 kids of her own and can barely make ends meet." She took a labored breath. "And she can't stay with you." "She's my daughter," Antonio protested, his fingers tightening slightly around hers. "She's an innocent," Elena countered. "Your world would destroy her one way or another." But the monitor beside her bed beeped steadily, marking the precious seconds passing between them. Outside, rain streaked the windows again, the sky as grey as Elena's complexion. "There's a family," Elena continued, each word clearly costing her energy she couldn't spare. "The Hendersons. They've been fostering Isabella on weekends when I've been too sick to care for her. Good people, teachers. They want to adopt her." Antonio felt as though he'd been struck. "Strangers? You'd leave our daughter with strangers rather than her own father?" "I'd leave her with people who live in the light," Eleanor whispered, "not the shadows. People who argue about mortgage payments and PTA meetings, not territory and vendettas." Before Antonio could respond, Isabella returned, carefully carrying a paper cup of ice chips. "The nurse says you can have these, but not too many because of your medicine." Both adults composed their expressions, the momentous discussion temporarily suspended. Antonio watched as Elena allowed Isabella to place an ice chip on her parched tongue, the tenderness between them a physical ache in his chest. "Isabella, would you like to get something from the cafeteria?" Antonio suggested, reaching for his wallet. "I bet they have ice cream." The child's eyes lit up, but she looked to her mother for permission. At Elena's weak nod, she accepted the $20 bill Antonio offered. "Can I get chocolate and vanilla swirl?" she asked hopefully. "Get whatever you like," Antonio smiled. "Marco will go with you." When the warehouse reeked of fish and seawater, its location on the docks providing convenient access for both legitimate and illegitimate shipments. Antonio sat at the head of the makeshift conference table, watching as his captains argued strategies for dealing with the Russo problem. His mind, however, kept drifting back to the hospital, to Elena's fading heartbeat and Isabella's trusting eyes. "We hit their distribution center tonight," Salvatore insisted, grief for his murdered nephew hardening his features. "Show them the consequences of moving against us." "Their distribution center is too well protected," Marco countered. "We'd lose more men than we could afford." The debate continued, voices rising and falling like the tide against the dock outside. Antonio remained silent, rolling an ice cube in his whiskey glass, remembering Isabella carefully placing ice chips on her mother's tongue. "Boss?" Paolo's voice cut through his thoughts. "Your decision." All eyes turned to Antonio expectantly. These men had followed him for years, trusted his judgment, his ruthlessness. What would they think if they knew he was considering stepping back from the life for the sake of a child he'd only just met? "We don't hit their distribution center," Antonio said finally, setting down his glass. "We hit Vincent Russo himself." A stunned silence fell over the room. Vincent Russo, the patriarch of the rival family, had been untouchable for years, protected by layers of security and a truce that, until recently, had kept direct attacks against family heads off limits. "The old man!" Salvatore blinked in surprise. "That would start a war like we haven't seen in decades." "We're already in a war," Antonio replied coldly. "I'm merely suggesting we end it definitively." The strategy was discussed in lowered voices, plans formed and discarded, until a workable approach emerged. Vincent Russo would be vulnerable at his grandson's baptism the following afternoon, a church ceremony where his security would be present but constrained by the public setting and sacred location. "We strike as he leaves the church," Antonio concluded. "Clean, quick, minimal collateral damage." The men around the table nodded in agreement, energized by the boldness of the plan. Only Paolo seemed troubled, his brow furrowed as he studied Antonio. "And you'll lead this yourself?" he asked pointedly. Antonio hesitated, thinking of his promise to meet the Hendersons tomorrow, the couple Elena wanted to entrust with his daughter. "I'll oversee the operation remotely. Marco will lead the team on the ground." The answer clearly displeased his consigliere, but Paolo knew better than to challenge him publicly. As the meeting dispersed, however, he cornered Antonio in the small office adjoining the warehouse floor. "You've never missed a major operation," Paolo said bluntly. "Especially not one targeting a head of family. What's going on, Antonio?" The question hung between them, weighted with decades of shared history. Paolo had been there when Antonio took control of his father's crumbling organization, had helped build it into the empire it was today. He deserved some explanation. "I have a daughter," Antonio admitted finally, "with Elena Moretti." Paolo's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "Elena, the woman who disappeared 10 years ago? You found her?" "She's dying. Cancer. Days left at most." The words still felt unreal on Antonio's tongue. "Our daughter is 10 years old. Elena kept her from me all this time, trying to protect her from this life." Understanding dawned on Paolo's face. "The hospital visits, your distraction. But surely you're not considering—" "I don't know what I'm considering," Antonio interrupted sharply. "I only know I have a responsibility to that child. A responsibility I've already neglected for a decade without knowing it." Paolo stepped closer, lowering his voice despite the privacy of the office. "Antonio, think about what you're saying. If word gets out that you have a daughter, an unprotected daughter, every enemy we've ever made will see her as leverage against you." The brutal truth of the statement chilled Antonio's blood. Elena had been right all along. His world was no place for Isabella. "Tomorrow afternoon," Paolo continued, pressing his advantage, Vincent Russo will be eliminated. Our position will be stronger than ever. Don't jeopardize everything for a child you barely know." Antonio's hand moved before he could think, shoving Paolo against the wall, forearm pressed against his throat. "That child is my blood," he growled. "Choose your next words carefully, old friend." To his credit, Paolo didn't flinch, despite the very real threat. "Your blood is exactly why she's in danger," he wheezed against the pressure. "As long as she's connected to you, she'll never be safe." Antonio released him abruptly, the echo of Elena's nearly identical words ringing in his ears. Both his lover and his consigliere, from vastly different perspectives, had reached the same conclusion. "The operation proceeds as planned tomorrow," Antonio said, straightening his suit jacket. "I'll join you afterward." The Hendersons arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, just as Elena had said they would. Robert Henderson was a tall, lean man with prematurely grey hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His wife, Sarah, was shorter, with a practical bob and the sturdy build of someone who spent their days chasing after children. They brought flowers for Elena and a new sketchbook for Isabella, clearly comfortable in the hospital room they had visited many times before. Antonio observed them from a corner chair, noting every detail with the same attention he would give to evaluating a potential threat. Robert taught high school mathematics. Sarah ran the library at the same school. They owned a modest house in a good school district, drove sensible cars, and had been unable to have children of their own, despite years of trying. "Mr. Velluti." Robert extended his hand after the initial greetings. "Elena has told us about you, about your relationship with Isabella." The careful phrasing indicated that Elena had shared at least part of the truth with these people. Antonio shook the offered hand, assessing the firm grip, the steady gaze that met his without fear, but with appropriate caution. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Antonio suggested, glancing at Isabella, who was showing Sarah her latest drawings. The four adults stepped into the hallway, leaving Isabella temporarily under the watchful eye of Marco, who had developed a surprising rapport with the child over the past few days. "Elena has explained that you're Isabella's biological father," Sarah began directly once they were out of earshot, "and that you've only recently learned about her." Antonio appreciated the straightforward approach. "That's correct. I also understand that you've been caring for Isabella periodically throughout Elena's illness, and that you wished to adopt her when—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "When I'm gone," Elena supplied softly, "which will be very soon." Robert put a supportive arm around Elena's thin shoulders. The gesture of casual intimacy spoke volumes about the relationship they had developed. These strangers had been there for Elena, while Antonio, oblivious to her suffering, had been managing his criminal empire. "We love Isabella," Sarah said simply. "We've known her for almost 3 years now, since Elena first got sick. She stayed with us on weekends, school holidays, during hospital stays. She has her own room in our home, friends in our neighborhood." "Elena mentioned you want to remain part of Isabella's life," Robert added, studying Antonio carefully. "We need to understand what that means exactly." Antonio had rehearsed this conversation in his mind throughout the sleepless night, weighing each word for its implications. "I have no desire to disrupt Isabella's life further. She's facing enough upheaval with her mother's illness. But she is my daughter, and I intend to be present in her life in whatever capacity is appropriate." "Appropriate," Robert repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. Elena intervened, her voice weak but determined. "Antonio has agreed that Isabella's well-being comes first. That means a stable home, regular school attendance, normal childhood activities, and visits with her father," Antonio added firmly. The Hendersons exchanged glances, a silent communication between long-time partners. "We would need assurances," Sarah finally said, "about safety, about consistency." The implication was clear. They knew, or at least suspected, what Antonio did for a living. Elena must have told them enough to make them cautious without revealing so much that they would refuse outright. "I can provide both," Antonio assured them, "along with financial support for Isabella's education and any other needs." Before the conversation could continue, Antonio's phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from Paolo. "Team in position, awaiting final confirmation." The timing couldn't have been worse. Vincent Russo would be leaving the church in less than an hour now, and Antonio was expected to give the final authorization for the hit. Yet here he stood, negotiating the future of his newly discovered daughter with a librarian and a math teacher, while Eleanor's life ebbed away in a hospital bed. "I need to step out briefly," he announced. "Business matter that can't wait." Eleanor's gaze sharpened, understanding too well what kind of business required his attention. The Hendersons nodded politely, oblivious to the weight of the decision hanging in the balance. Isabella looked up from her drawing. "Will you come back?" The simple question carried implications beyond the child's understanding. Would he come back to this room, to this tentative new arrangement? Or would he choose the life he had built, the power he had accumulated, the reputation he had earned through years of calculated violence? "Yes," Antonio promised, meeting his daughter's trusting gaze. "I'll come back." In the hospital corridor, he dialed Paolo's number, stepping into an empty waiting area for privacy. "We're ready," Paolo reported without preamble. "Russo's ceremony runs another 30 minutes. Our people are in position for when he exits." Antonio closed his eyes, seeing Isabella's drawing of all of them together. Her innocent vision of a future that could never exist as she imagined it. "Call it off," he said quietly. "What?" Paolo's disbelief carried clearly through the phone. "Antonio, our men are already in place. Salvatore is expecting retribution for his nephew." "Find another way," Antonio instructed. "Target their shipments, their revenue streams, but not Vincent himself. Not today." A long silence followed. "This isn't like you," Paolo finally said. "Whatever is happening with this woman, with this child, it's affecting your judgment." Perhaps it was. For the first time in decades, Antonio was considering consequences beyond the immediate tactical advantages, looking ahead to what kind of future he wanted for his daughter, even if he could only be a peripheral part of it. "My judgment is clear," Antonio replied firmly. "Call it off. That's an order, not a request." When Antonio returned to Elena's room, the atmosphere had changed. A doctor stood beside her bed, speaking in hushed tones while the Hendersons kept Isabella occupied in the corner. Antonio approached cautiously, catching only fragments of the medical assessment. Deteriorating rapidly, kidney function declining, comfort measures only. Elena's eyes found his as he approached, a silent message passing between them. Time, already in short supply, was running out faster than anticipated. "Days?" Antonio asked the doctor quietly. The physician's expression was grave. "Hours, most likely, perhaps through the night if we're fortunate." The brutal timeline hit Antonio like a physical blow. Hours left to resolve a lifetime of complications, to establish an arrangement for Isabella's future, to say whatever needed to be said before Eleanor took her secrets and regrets into the final darkness. "Isabella needs to say goodbye," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I don't want her last memories to be this." She gestured weakly at the medical equipment surrounding her, the visible evidence of her body's surrender. Antonio understood immediately. "I'll take her out for a few hours, give you time to rest, to prepare." Elena nodded gratefully, then beckoned the Hendersons closer. "You too," she insisted. "All of you go. Do something normal, something happy. Then come back." The suggestion was both generous and heartbreaking. Elena's final gift to her daughter was the permission to step away from the deathbed vigil, to experience a few hours of ordinary life before grief descended permanently. "Isabella," Antonio called gently. "How would you like to get some lunch with me and Mr. and Mrs. Henderson? Maybe visit the park afterward if it's not raining?" The child looked uncertainly between the adults and her mother's bed. "But who will stay with Mom?" "I'll be fine," Eleanor assured her with a wan smile. "The nurses will check on me, and I need to sleep for a while. You go have fun, and tell me all about it when you get back." Isabella still seemed doubtful, her young mind perhaps more aware of the gravity of the situation than the adults realized. "Promise you'll be here when I get back?" The innocent question hung in the air, unanswerable with honesty. Elena swallowed hard before responding. "I promise I'll be right here in this bed." It was the best she could offer, and everyone in the room except Isabella recognized the careful evasion. The child finally nodded, gathering her sketchbook and her one-eyed teddy bear. As they prepared to leave, Elena beckoned Antonio back to her bedside for a private word. "Keep her safe," she whispered fiercely, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "And remember what we discussed, the middle path. It's the only way." Antonio nodded, memorizing the features of her face one last time. The determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes now clouded by pain medication, the stubborn curl that still fell across her forehead despite the ravages of disease. "I'll bring her back to say goodbye," he promised softly. "And after?" Elena pressed, her fingers tightening on his. "After," Antonio repeated, "I'll do what's necessary, for her sake." The unlikely group, a crime boss, a math teacher, a librarian, and a 10-year-old girl clutching a teddy bear, made their way through the hospital corridors in awkward silence. In the elevator, Isabella slipped her small hand into Antonio's without comment, the simple gesture of trust nearly undoing him. Outside, the day had cleared, the morning's rain giving way to watery sunshine. Antonio's sleek black car waited at the curb, Marco standing beside it, vigilant as always. "Perhaps we should take our car," Robert Henderson suggested, eyeing the imposing vehicle and the armed guard with obvious discomfort. Antonio felt Isabella's hand tighten in his. Would this be the first of many small rejections? The beginning of the separation Elena had insisted was necessary. Before he could respond, Isabella spoke up. "Can we take Antonio's car? It's bigger and shinier." The simple request broke the tension. Sarah Henderson smiled despite herself, and even Robert's expression softened slightly. "If Mr. Velluti doesn't mind," he conceded. "Not at all," Antonio replied, feeling a small victory in this first test of the fragile arrangement they were attempting to build. As they drove to a nearby restaurant, Antonio found himself hyper-aware of potential threats. Every passing car, every pedestrian on the sidewalk became a possible danger to the child sitting beside him, chattering about her favorite foods. Was this how Elena had lived for 10 years? In constant fear that his world would reach out and claim what she loved most? Would he be able to keep his daughter safe if the wrong people discovered her existence? The question Paolo had raised earlier echoed in his mind. Could Isabella ever truly be safe as long as she was connected to him? At the restaurant, a family-friendly Italian place selected by the Hendersons, Antonio watched Isabella dive into a plate of spaghetti with childish abandon, sauce speckling her chin. The normalcy of the scene was disorienting after days of hospital vigils and Mafia councils. "Do you like spaghetti too?" Isabella asked him between mouthfuls, her expression earnest. Such a simple question, yet Antonio found himself struggling to remember the last time anyone had asked him about his personal preferences. In his world, people asked what he wanted done, what targets he wanted eliminated, what territories he wanted conquered, never what foods he enjoyed. "I prefer penne," he answered honestly. "But spaghetti is good too." Isabella nodded seriously, as though this information were critically important. "Mom likes fettuccine best, but the hospital only gives her soup and jello." The reminder of Elena, waiting alone in her hospital room for death to claim her, cast a shadow over the meal. The Hendersons exchanged a glance, their concern for Isabella evident. How much did the child truly understand about what was happening? How much had Elena prepared her for the inevitable loss? After lunch, they visited a nearby park as promised. Isabella raced to the swings, leaving the adults to sit awkwardly on a bench, watching her from a distance. Marco positioned himself beneath a tree, scanning the area with professional thoroughness. "Is he always with you?" Sarah asked quietly, nodding toward the bodyguard. Antonio nodded. "It's necessary in my position." "And would Isabella need such protection if she were to spend time with you?" Robert's question was pointed but not hostile, a practical consideration from a man trying to assess all risks. "Yes," Antonio admitted. "Which is why Elena's suggestion has merit. Limited contact in public settings with no obvious connection between us." The afternoon at the park stretched into a strange bubble of normalcy that felt increasingly surreal to Antonio. Isabella played on the swings, fed ducks at the pond, and begged for ice cream from a passing vendor. All ordinary childhood activities that stood in stark contrast to the tense negotiations between the adults and the knowledge of Elena's rapidly declining condition. Antonio found himself watching Isabella with an intensity that bordered on desperation, trying to memorize every gesture, every expression, every laugh. Would these hours be the only truly carefree moments he would share with his daughter? The clock was ticking, not just for Elena, but for his relationship with Isabella as well. His phone vibrated persistently in his pocket. Paolo, no doubt furious about the aborted hit on Vincent Russo, demanding explanations. Antonio ignored it. For these few precious hours, he would be only Isabella's father, not the head of Chicago's most powerful crime family. "She has your smile," Sarah Henderson observed quietly, following his gaze to where Isabella was showing Robert how to make a daisy chain. Elena mentioned that, said she knew from the moment Isabella was born whose daughter she was. The comment caught Antonio off guard. He had been so focused on Isabella's eyes, the most obvious inheritance from him, that he hadn't noticed the similarity in their smiles. Another piece of his daughter he was just beginning to discover. "How much did Elena tell you?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "About me. About us." Sarah considered the question carefully before answering, enough to understand why she left, not enough to judge either of you. She paused, watching as Isabella placed the completed daisy crown on Robert's head, giggling at the result. "She never spoke of you with hatred, if that's what you're wondering. Regret, yes. Fear, certainly. But never hatred." The revelation was unexpected. In Antonio's world, betrayal was met with vengeance, not regret. The thought that Elena might have carried some tenderness for him through their years of separation was both comforting and painful. "What do you know about what I do?" he asked directly. There was no point in pretense. If these people were going to raise his daughter, they needed to understand the reality of his existence. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Elena said you were involved in organized activities that often crossed legal boundaries. She mentioned that you controlled significant parts of Chicago's economy, both legitimate and otherwise. Beyond that, she left the details to our imagination." A diplomatic way of saying that Elena had told them he was a mafia boss, without using those exact words. Antonio nodded, appreciating the directness. "And knowing that you're still willing to adopt Isabella, to allow me some presence in her life." "We love her," Sarah said simply. "We've watched Elena struggle with this illness for 3 years, watched Isabella try to be brave through all of it. If accepting certain complexities in her life means giving her stability and safety, then yes, we can manage that. From across the park came Isabella's voice, calling them to see something she had found, a small turtle making its slow way through the grass. The three adults moved toward her, their conversation temporarily suspended, but the implications lingering in the air between them. Antonio's phone vibrated again. This time he glanced at the screen to see not Paolo's name, but Marco's. Unusual, since his bodyguard was standing just yards away, still vigilantly scanning the park. Antonio looked up, meeting Marco's gaze across the distance. The subtle shake of his head communicated what words couldn't. Something was wrong. "Excuse me for a moment," Antonio murmured to the Hendersons, stepping away to take the call. "Boss!" Marco's voice was tense, even in the single syllable. "Hospital called. They've been trying to reach you." Antonio's blood turned to ice. "Elena!" "Critical condition. They're saying minutes, not hours." The world seemed to tilt beneath Antonio's feet. They had left the hospital less than 3 hours ago. The doctor had said Elena might last through the night. How could things have deteriorated so rapidly? "We need to go back. Now." Antonio turned, searching for Isabella, where she knelt beside the turtle, still showing it to Robert Henderson. The carefree afternoon shattered like glass around him. How did he tell a 10-year-old child that her final moments with her mother had arrived sooner than anyone expected? Sarah, perceptive as always, had already noted the change in his demeanor and approached with concern in her eyes. "What's wrong?" "And the hospital called," Antonio explained in a low voice. "Elena's condition has worsened significantly. We need to get back immediately." Understanding flooded Sarah's face. "I'll get Isabella and Robert," she said, already moving toward them. Antonio watched as she knelt beside Isabella, speaking softly. The child's expression transformed from curiosity to alarm in an instant. The turtle forgotten, Isabella ran toward Antonio, panic in her eyes. "We need to go back to Mom!" she cried, reaching for his hand. "Mrs. Henderson says she needs us." "Yes, Piccola," Antonio confirmed, using the endearment unconsciously. "We're going right now." The drive back to the hospital was tense, with a different kind of fear than Antonio was accustomed to managing. Not the calculated risk of business operations or the strategic maneuvering of territory disputes, but the primal fear of loss, of time running out, of words left unsaid. Isabella sat rigid beside him, clutching her teddy bear so tightly the remaining stuffing bulged from its seams. The Hendersons sat in uncomfortable silence in the back seat. Marco drove with reckless speed, running yellow lights and taking corners at dangerous angles. No one objected. "Will Mom be okay?" Isabella asked in a small voice as they neared the hospital. The question carried the weight of innocence, still hoping against hope for a miracle. Antonio found he couldn't lie to her. "She's very sick, Isabella. The doctors are doing everything they can. But you'll make her better, right?" Isabella persisted, looking up at him with those familiar eyes, his eyes, now swimming with unshed tears. "You can do anything. You're important. People do what you say." The child's perception of his power, likely gleaned from observing how others deferred to him, struck Antonio like a physical blow. In her young mind, his authority extended even to commanding death itself to retreat. If only that were true. "Some things even I can't control," he admitted softly as Marco pulled up to the hospital entrance. "But we'll be with her, and that's what matters most right now." They rushed through the corridors, Isabella practically running ahead of them, knowing the path to her mother's room by heart. Antonio caught up to her just before she could burst through the door, placing a restraining hand on her shoulder. "Wait, Isabella," he cautioned, noting the medical staff moving efficiently around Elena's bed through the small window. "Let me check first." Antonio entered Elena's room first, leaving Isabella momentarily with the Hendersons. The scene inside confirmed his worst fears. Doctors checking monitors, a nurse adjusting medication levels, the unmistakable atmosphere of medical crisis. Elena lay still and pale against the sheets, her breathing shallow and irregular. Her eyes fluttered open at his approach, recognition dawning slowly through the haze of pain medication. "Antonio," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Isabella. She's here, outside with the Hendersons." Antonio moved to her bedside, taking her fragile hand in his. "The hospital called. They said—" "I know what they said." A ghost of Elena's old determination flickered across her face. "I told them to wait until you got back." Stubborn to the end, right? Despite everything, Antonio found himself smiling at her familiar defiance. "Always." "Is she okay?" Eleanor asked, concern for their daughter evident even now. "Did she have a good time?" "She's fine. We went to the park. She found a turtle." Such mundane details to share in these final moments, yet they seemed to bring Elena comfort. "And the Hendersons?" Antonio nodded. "Good people. You chose well." Relief washed over Elena's gaunt features. "You'll honor our agreement? The middle path?" "I will," Antonio promised, knowing it would be the hardest commitment he had ever made. "Isabella will have a normal life with them, and I'll be present without endangering her." A faint smile touched Elena's lips. "Thank you." Her gaze drifted to the door. "Bring her in now. I don't have long." Antonio gestured to the medical staff, who moved discreetly away from the bed, giving them space for these final moments. Then he opened the door, beckoning Isabella inside. The child hesitated at the threshold, suddenly afraid of what awaited her. Antonio knelt to her level, speaking gently. "Your mom wants to see you, Isabella. She's very tired, but she's waiting for you." Isabella nodded bravely, squaring her small shoulders before entering the room. The Hendersons followed at a respectful distance, their presence supportive but unobtrusive. "Mommy!" Isabella approached the bed cautiously, her voice small and uncertain. Elena turned toward her daughter with visible effort, summoning a smile that transformed her pain-ravaged face. "There's my beautiful girl. Come closer." Isabella climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, mindful of the tubes and wires surrounding her mother. "We saw a turtle at the park," she reported, as though continuing a normal conversation. "And I made a daisy crown for Mr. Henderson." "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart." Elena reached out a trembling hand to touch her daughter's cheek. "I want you to listen carefully now, okay? What I'm going to say is very important." Isabella nodded solemnly, sensing the gravity of the moment despite her young age. "Okay, Mommy." "I have to go away soon," Eleanor began, her voice steadying with the effort of making these last words count. "Not because I want to, but because sometimes our bodies get too tired to keep going." "Because of the cancer?" Isabella asked, her lower lip trembling. "Yes, because of the cancer." Elena's fingers weakly brushed a strand of hair from Isabella's forehead. "And when I go, you're going to live with Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. They'll take very good care of you." Isabella glanced back at the couple standing quietly near the door, then at Antonio, confusion evident in her expression. "But what about Antonio? Can't I live with him? He's your friend." Elena's eyes met Antonio's over their daughter's head, a lifetime of complications distilled into a single glance. "Antonio is more than my friend, Isabella. He's your father." The revelation hung in the air like suspended glass, fragile and dangerous. Isabella's eyes widened, her gaze darting between the adults as she processed this new information. "My father?" she repeated, disbelief mingling with a dawning comprehension. "But you said my father was far away and couldn't be with us. I thought that was best at the time," Elena explained gently. "I was trying to protect you. But now you need to know the truth. Antonio is your father, and he loves you very much. He'll still be part of your life, even though you'll live with the Hendersons." Isabella turned to Antonio, studying him with new eyes, not just as her mother's mysterious friend, but as the father she had never known she had. Is that why we have the same eyes? Antonio nodded, finding words suddenly difficult. Yes, Isabella, that's why. A monitor beside the bed began beeping more rapidly, signaling Elena's declining condition. The medical staff moved forward, but Elena waved them back weakly. Not yet, she insisted. Please, just a few more minutes. The doctor nodded reluctantly, adjusting something on one of the machines before stepping back again. Antonio recognized the gesture for what it was, a final mercy, allowing Elena these last moments with her daughter. Isabella, Elena continued, her breathing becoming more labored, I need you to be brave now, braver than you've ever been. Can you do that for me? The child nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I'll try, Mummy. Good girl. Eleanor's smile was heartbreaking in its tenderness. Remember that I love you, always, more than anything in this world. And when you miss me, just close your eyes and remember how much I love you, and it will be like I'm right there with you. Antonio watched helplessly as mother and daughter clung to each other, feeling like an intruder in this most intimate of goodbyes. Yet he couldn't look away, couldn't step back. This moment, painful as it was part of his daughter's life, a piece of the 10 years he had missed. The monitors began beeping more insistently. Elena's breathing grew shallower, her words coming with greater effort. Take care of each other, she whispered, her gaze encompassing Isabella, Antonio, and the Hendersons. Promise me. We promise, Sarah Henderson answered for all of them, her voice thick with tears. Elena's eyes sought Antonio's one last time. In their depths, he saw not accusation or regret, but a final plea. Keep her safe, give her the life I wanted for her, be better than the man I fled from. I promise, he whispered, the words a sacred vow. Elena nodded slightly, as if his assurance was all she needed to let go. Her focus returned to Isabella, drinking in the sight of her daughter one last time. I love you, Mommy, Isabella sobbed, sensing the end approaching. I love you too, my sweet girl, Elena breathed, to the moon and back. Her eyes closed, her breathing slowed, and with one final gentle exhale, Elena Moretti slipped away from the world she had navigated so carefully to protect her daughter. The days following Elena's death passed in a blur of arrangements and adjustments. Antonio handled the funeral preparations with the same efficiency he brought to his business operations, ensuring Elena received a dignified service, despite her lack of family beyond Isabella. The Hendersons remained a constant presence, supporting Isabella through the rituals of grief while maintaining the tentative alliance with Antonio that would shape the girl's future. Isabella herself moved through these days with a stoicism that both impressed and concerned the adults around her. She didn't cry after those first moments at her mother's bedside, instead retreating into a quiet watchfulness, observing how the world continued to function despite the massive hole at its center. She's processing, Sarah Henderson explained gently, when Antonio expressed concern about Isabella's withdrawn behavior. Children grieve differently than adults. The tears will come again when she feels safe enough to let them. The funeral was small but beautiful, held in a sunlit chapel with windows overlooking a garden where butterflies danced among late summer flowers. Antonio had arranged for Elena's favorite music to play, classical pieces she had loved during their time together. Isabella sat between him and Sarah Henderson, her small hand occasionally reaching for his, during moments when the grief seemed too heavy to bear alone. Afterward, at the cemetery, Isabella placed a single white rose on her mother's casket before it was lowered into the ground. "Goodbye, Mommy," she whispered, her voice carrying in the quiet afternoon air. "I'll remember to be brave." The simple statement nearly undid Antonio's carefully maintained composure. This child, his daughter, had shown more courage in her 10 years than many of his hardened associates had demonstrated in lifetimes of navigating the criminal underworld. As they turned to leave the gravesite, Antonio noticed a familiar car parked at a discreet distance, Paolo watching the proceedings without intruding. A reminder that the world Antonio had temporarily set aside was still waiting, still demanding his attention and leadership. "We should talk about next steps," Robert Henderson suggested quietly as they reached the cars. "Isabella's things will need to be moved from Elena's apartment. There are school arrangements to consider, legal matters." Oh, Antonio nodded, appreciating the practical approach. "My lawyer is preparing the adoption paperwork. I've arranged to have access to Isabella's medical and educational records as her biological father, but with primary custody granted to you." He hesitated, glancing at the child who stood a few paces away, seemingly fascinated by a monarch butterfly that had landed on a nearby headstone. "And the other arrangements we discussed?" Sarah understood his meaning immediately. "Regular visits, beginning with supervised time at our home until Isabella adjusts. Then perhaps outings every other weekend, school events when possible. We'll make it work, Mr. Velluti." "Antonio," he corrected gently, "if we're going to co-parent in this unusual arrangement, I think first names are appropriate." The Hendersons exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them before Robert nodded. "Antonio, then, and thank you for making this easier than it might have been. Elena was concerned about how you would react to her wishes." The statement contained volumes of unspoken meaning. Elena had feared Antonio would simply take Isabella, using his power and influence to override any legal obstacles. That he had instead chosen to honor her wishes, to place Isabella's well-being above his own desires, seemed to have surprised everyone, including himself. "Isabella needs stability," Antonio said simply. "After everything she's been through, she deserves that much." The conversation was interrupted by Isabella herself, returning from her contemplation of the butterfly. "Can we go now?" she asked, fatigue evident in her voice. "Mom always said not to stay too long at sad places." "That sounds like good advice," Antonio agreed, offering her his hand. "Where would you like to go?" Isabella considered the question with the seriousness of a much older person. "Could we go to the ice cream place again? Mom would like that better than everyone being sad." The simple request brought sad smiles to the adults' faces. "Ice cream it is," Sarah confirmed, smoothing Isabella's dark hair, his hair, with a maternal hand. As they walked toward the cars, Isabella between him and the Hendersons, Antonio was struck by the strangeness of this new reality. He had gained and lost so much in the span of a single week, discovered a daughter he never knew existed, reconnected with the only woman he had ever truly loved only to watch her die, and now found himself navigating an unprecedented arrangement with two ordinary citizens who would raise his child in a world far removed from his own. Paolo was still waiting in his car, a respectful distance maintained, but his presence impossible to ignore. Antonio knew the conversation awaiting him, the fallout from the aborted Russo hit, the questions about his recent behavior, the rumblings of discontent among his captains, the business of power and violence that had defined his existence for so long. Yet for this moment, walking with his daughter toward the promise of ice cream and normal conversation, Antonio found himself considering possibilities he had never before entertained. Was there a way to maintain his position while stepping back from the day-to-day operations that put him, and by extension, Isabella, at risk? Could he gradually transition to the legitimate businesses that made up a significant portion of his empire, leaving the darker aspects to trusted lieutenants? The idea was radical, unprecedented in his world. Men like Antonio Velluti didn't retire or fade into respectability. They ruled until they were killed or imprisoned. There was no middle path in the Mafia, or so conventional wisdom held. But conventional wisdom had never accounted for Isabella. for the fierce, protective instinct that had awakened in him the moment he recognized his own eyes looking back at him from her small face. For her, he would find a way, create a middle path where none existed before. "Antonio?" Isabella's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Will you visit me at the Hendersons' house, even after all the papers and stuff?" The question revealed that despite her quiet demeanor, Isabella had been listening carefully to the adult conversations around her, understanding more than anyone realized about the arrangements being made for her future. "Yes, Piccola," he assured her, the endearment coming naturally now. "I'll visit as often as you want me to." Isabella nodded, seemingly satisfied with this promise. "Good, because you're my dad, and dads are supposed to be there, even if they live somewhere else." The simple declaration, spoken with a child's straightforward logic, settled something within Antonio. Whatever complications lay ahead, whatever dangers needed to be navigated or compromises made, Isabella recognized him as her father. Not the feared Mafia boss, not the powerful businessman, but simply her father. It was both less and infinitely more than any title he had ever held. 1 month after Elena's funeral, Antonio sat in his car outside the Hendersons' modest suburban home, watching as Isabella played basketball in the driveway with Robert. Her laughter carried across the autumn air, a sound that still surprised him with its capacity to pierce the armor he had built around himself over decades. The past weeks had brought significant changes to Antonio's organization. Paolo, after initial resistance, had come to understand, if not fully support, Antonio's gradual shift in priorities. The Russo situation had been resolved through a negotiated territory agreement rather than bloodshed. Several of Antonio's legitimate businesses had received increased attention and investment, positioning them for expansion that would eventually allow certain illegal operations to be scaled back without financial impact. None of these changes had been announced as part of a grand strategy. Antonio was too skilled in the arts of power to make his intentions so transparent. Instead, each move appeared logical, tactical, a restructuring to increase efficiency, a strategic retreat to focus on more profitable ventures. Only Paolo, who had known Antonio longest, recognized the pattern for what it was: preparation for a different kind of future. "You're really doing this," Paolo had remarked during a late-night conversation in Antonio's study. "Creating an exit strategy. For her." Antonio hadn't denied it. "A long-term transition," he had clarified. "Nothing sudden, nothing that would create instability or power vacuums, but yes, eventually." "Your father would call it weakness," Paolo had observed, not as criticism, but as simple fact. "My father died with 16 bullets in him before he saw 50, Antonio had countered, never knowing his granddaughter. Never experiencing anything beyond the life. I'm not sure his opinion should carry much weight. Now, watching Isabella execute a surprisingly skillful layup, Antonio felt a certainty that had been growing since Elena's death. He was making the right choice, the only choice that would allow him to be part of his daughter's life without tainting it with the darkness of his world. Robert spotted him and waved, alerting Isabella to his presence. Her face lit up as she turned, dropping the basketball and running toward his car with unrestrained enthusiasm. "Antonio!" "You came," she called, reaching the vehicle as he stepped out. Their visits had settled into a comfortable routine over the past month: Sunday afternoons at the Hendersons' home, occasional dinner outings to family restaurants where they wouldn't be recognized. Isabella still called him by his first name rather than Dad, but the bond between them was strengthening with each encounter. "I promised, didn't I?" He smiled, accepting her quick hug with a warmth that still felt new and fragile. "And I hear you've got some news." Isabella nodded excitedly, pulling him by the hand toward the house. "I made the school honor roll," And Mrs. Henderson helped me put Mom's picture in a special frame for my bedside table. Come see." Antonio followed willingly, exchanging a brief nod with Robert as they passed. The initial awkwardness between him and the Hendersons had gradually eased into a workable relationship built on their shared concern for Isabella's well-being. Inside, Sarah greeted him with polite warmth. "Perfect timing. Dinner's almost ready if you'd like to join us." These ordinary domestic scenes, family dinners, homework discussions, basketball in the driveway, had become precious to Antonio in ways he would never have anticipated. They offered glimpses of the normal childhood Isabella would have, the life Elena had wanted for her. "Antonio, come see my room. Come see my—" Isabella insisted, tugging him toward the stairs. "I put up the pictures we took at the aquarium last week." As he followed her up to her bedroom, a cheerful space painted in shades of blue and green, Antonio noted the seamless blend of old and new in Isabella's life. Elena's presence remained in photographs and small mementos, while new elements reflected her adaptation to life with the Hendersons, a balance that seemed to be helping her heal from the profound loss she had experienced. "See? That's us with the shark exhibit." Isabella pointed proudly to a framed photo on her desk, the two of them standing before an enormous aquarium tank, Antonio looking uncharacteristically casual in jeans and a sweater rather than his usual tailored suit. "That was a good day," he acknowledged, remembering how Isabella had peppered the marine biologist with questions about shark behavior, showing the same intensity of focus that he brought to business negotiations. "Mrs. Henderson says you can take me to the Science Museum next time if you want," Isabella informed him, straightening the photo precisely. "They have a new exhibit about space." "I'd like that," Antonio agreed, touched by this evidence that the Hendersons were actively supporting his relationship with Isabella, not merely tolerating it as their agreement required. Dinner was a surprisingly comfortable affair, with Isabella dominating the conversation, describing school projects and friend dramas with animated gestures that reminded Antonio painfully of Eleanor. He contributed where appropriate, adjusting his usual commanding presence to fit this domestic setting. As the meal concluded, Sarah mentioned casually, "Isabella's school has a father-daughter dance coming up next month. We thought you might want to take her, if your schedule permits." The invitation, for it was clearly that rather than a mere information share, caught Antonio off guard. The father-daughter dance would be a public event, attended by school staff, parents and children who knew Isabella as the Hendersons' soon-to-be adopted daughter. His presence would raise questions, create complications, yet the hopeful look on Isabella's face made refusal impossible to consider. "I'd be honored," he said simply. Later, as he prepared to leave, Isabella walked him to his car. The evening had grown chilly, and she hugged herself against the cold, reminding him suddenly and painfully of Elena doing the same gesture on a winter night long ago. "Mom would be happy," Isabella said suddenly, looking up at him with those familiar dark eyes, his eyes, "about us knowing each other now, even though she was scared before." The insight startled Antonio. "What makes you say that?" Isabella shrugged with the peculiar wisdom children sometimes display. "She kept your picture in her special box with important things. I found it once when I was looking for Band-Aids. She said you were someone she used to love very much, but that sometimes love isn't enough when people live in different worlds." Antonio felt a tightness in his chest at this revelation. Elena had kept his photograph despite everything, the fear, the separation, the years of hiding. Perhaps she had always known this moment would come, when the separate worlds they had chosen would collide in the person of their daughter. "Different worlds can sometimes find a middle path," he said softly, echoing Eleanor's words that had become his guiding principle. Isabella nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "That's what we're doing, right? Finding a middle path?" "Yes, Piccola," Antonio confirmed, touched by her understanding. That's exactly what we're doing." As he drove away, watching Isabella wave from the Hendersons' front porch, Antonio felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for decades. The path ahead would not be easy. Balancing his existing world with this new role would require careful navigation, constant vigilance, and sacrifices he was only beginning to understand. But for the first time since Elena had fled with their unborn child, since he had hardened himself into the man his position required, Antonio Velluti glimpsed the possibility of redemption. Not a complete transformation. He harbored no illusions about erasing the choices he had made or the blood on his hands, but a chance to be something more than the sum of his darkest deeds. For Isabella, he would continue finding this middle path, step by careful step. And perhaps, in doing so, he would honor Elena's memory in the only way that truly mattered, by becoming the father she had feared he could never be.